Welcome to the Family Pictures podcast, and I forgot to introduce us last time. I'm Michael Branson Smith, and this guy over there is
Jim Groom.
Jim Groom. Welcome
Kim Droom.
to Kim Droom, the final film in our Frontier Families series, which culminates and anti-culminates, I think, in family sense. It's an anti. Not climatic, it's very climatic. Jeremiah Johnson, in 1972 film directed by Sidney Pollack, written by John Milius and some other guy that we don't care about because John Milius is the maniac who authored the original script, though it got some doctoring, even though he turned out to be one of the ultimate script doctors in his later years, too.
Yeah. What do you think the guy doctored from John Milius? Like, what was his contribution? It would be interesting to know.
It was Edward Anhalt, and
Like,
God, there was something that was mentioned that was specific, but I honestly don't care because this feels like John Milius, the kind of libertarian maniac. He's constantly described as, what was it, a Zen anarchist or something wacky. I don't know. Like he's like
a
this
Maoist, an NRA, advocate. Just
right. He was the man who stood apart.
Called Milius. Yes. That is, he's worth seeing.
Yeah, he's the man who stood apart amongst his peers, Scorsese and Lucas and Spielberg, as kind of like the maniac who was never quite as successful, but always there and always writing. He was like prolific writer, and he wrote many films that were never produced. But thank goodness Jeremiah Johnson was actually made into a film. It was the second film that Sidney Pollack would direct Robert Redford as a starring vehicle, and he would do 5 more after this. And the two had met on set of a film where they were both acting. Sidney Pollack, kind of a lesser of director of that era, but still, he persisted and made a lot of good films. Even won an Academy Award for the film They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Which I've never watched, and I watched a trailer for it, and it looked psychotic. It's this film about like marathon dancing with Jane Fonda, and she's literally like murdered by her partner at the end, or put out of her misery. Is more direct.
Pollack has some strange range too. Like he goes from Western with Jeremiah Johnson, which we'll be talking about to Paranoia film, one of the greats of the 70s, 3 Days of the Condor, to The Way We Were, to The Electric Horseman,
or Tootsie, which is probably one of his most famous films.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like he's kind of all over the place, but he's kind of a mark of quality. When he does a film, there's a good sense that it's going to be a damn good film. And
he's a great actor too. I loved him and Michael Clayton, as the like senior partner at the firm that is doing the evil deed of working with the drug company that has devastated a family.
I mean, he was in Kubrick's final film, right?
Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah, where he's having sex with the woman in the bathroom and he has a heart attack and Tom Cruise comes in. But I remember him most clearly from Husbands and Wives, when him and Judy Davis are a couple. And they're just awesome. Like he's a great actor. Amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, one of my favorite films is The Firm. I think he really it's the pinnacle of like film pacing because he has that incredible piano score throughout as well, and it's a very rewatchable film. But this film was something that is interesting in that it was back in an era where they were really trying to control budgets, and they tried to tell Robert Redford and Sidney Pollack, you need to do this on the lots. And I can't even imagine what this thing would have been if they had done it like a typical Western in the lots of LA, as well as the closest, mountain they could find.
But Robert Valley.
Redford refused to do it. And if they didn't film it in Utah, which this is the home of, Sundance. This is where Robert Redford makes his home, his real home. And, there's much about him. This is where the Sundance Film Festival is born. And he makes much about describing like giving people tours and basically keeping the production going as they froze their way through the landscape. I mean, some of it looks miserable. I mean, and
Oh,
Robert Redford is literally diving in a frozen creek in one scene, trying to catch a fish by hands. And I was like, holy cow, he's
yeah.
amazing. And it's not like suddenly get up and step into his trailer. Like there are actual, they're working with tents and whatnot. And they all stayed in like crappy motels apparently.
And
Uh,
there's so much snow on the ground during that scene. It's like 3 feet of snow coming
right.
into that little stream. And Antonella, as we were watching it, and this is the second time we watched this film recently, she was like, God, like there's so much snow and he must be freezing his ass off. And like
Yeah.
you can see it in the
Uh-huh.
it's like
Yeah.
that's one of those moments where you don't know how much acting is or how much it's just the abuse of the environment, which is kind
Right.
of interesting given many of the themes that come up in Jeremiah Johnson.
Yeah, and he describes it as one of his favorite films he ever did, and it probably has much to do. I mean, this is an actor who was apart in many ways. Like he made his home in the wilderness of Utah.
Yeah.
Who else does that at the time? And he says he described it's like he suffers but he continues on, and I think he took that to heart because he must have been literally suffering as an actor quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of made Park City a destination, right? With Sundance and
Absolutely.
everything else. Like he
Yeah.
kind of built a whole independent film industry that so many people benefited from in the 90s, which is another interesting part of his career, but not
Oh,
Jeremiah Johnson, right?
Oh, it stands apart from his entire career as an actor as equally important in many, many ways, and I'm
Sure.
sure there's so many have spoken much more about that. And so, this is I thought this was like other random production notes. This was an era because we didn't have home video, and re-releasing a film was a thing.
Yeah.
So this was released in 1972, and they re-released it in 1973 and 74, and basically double the money on the film, which is kind of wild because if a film's super popular and you missed it, this was the only way to watch it, right? They weren't doing the ABC movie of the week on Friday night. Like that didn't really exist yet either.
Jeremiah Johnson is one of those films that never, because of, like you're saying, it was re-released in theaters, and I'm sure it was out on VHS and then DVD, but it's never one of those films that I caught in my teens, early 20s until I went to
Mm.
college and saw it there. So like it was, or so not early 20s, but teens. So it's one of those movies that was very much 70s in that it spoke to another generation. But I find it interesting because it's also one of those movies that's part of the meme generation now, particularly in
Yeah,
that scene when he's capturing that otter, or no, that beaver,
Beaver.
and
Yeah,
then they have that close up on him or that kind of
the
zoom
zoom
in.
in. Yeah,
Oh, it's so great. And so
yeah.
you may not have seen the movie, but you know Jeremiah Johnson.
Right. Yeah. The character. Yeah. Him. I mean, that's the whole meme culture is like the character is abstracted out of its environment and means completely different things. Um, and Yeah, I mean, this is an unusual movie at first it would appear to be an unusual film to pick as a family picture because it is about a survivalist, a mountain man, a man who lives alone, who goes to the wild. And I probably thought about it that way. I mean, the way I'm if I were to guess how I probably first saw this was one of the many watches of 70s films of the new Hollywood I would watch on a Sunday morning on a random like independent adjacent to the major networks. And my brother would go out and play football. I would watch 70s classics or karate movies. I've talked about I want to figure out how to do a karate movie theme someday because I fucking love 70s karate movies and the wuchai genre in general. It was awesome. But yeah, this is and I probably thought because I would love the woods back then as a kid, and I was like, yeah, living in the woods alone, how cool! You can make your way, totally missing the point and watching it many, many years later. And I think people at the time even missed the point. Like a lot of the critics at the time were just like, oh, this movie's so ponderous in its pacing, yet another horse, struggling through the snow across the landscape and just working the land. And, in the context of the new land, which is even more ponderously going through labor, but it's more appreciated than anything. And I think that's was missed at the time. And um, they also saw it as this icon, this character as an icon of independence, if you will. And this is one of the things and we're going to talk about it more, what I'm beginning to appreciate, like using family as a context to talk about like these ideas and these themes, in particular the Western, because the story starts with a story of escape and the idea of it being romantic, and he comes into this, you know, home frontier town approached with a bizarre pontoon made out
Oh,
of two canoes.
it's like a catamaran, right? It was
Yeah,
so
catamaran. Thank
interesting.
you. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, and it's just a bizarre construction, but it's immediately this very diverse and myth making town. It's like white people living with former slaves and Native Americans, and everybody's friendly and like, how do I go find me some the plain language? How do I find me some critters to kill and make money off of? It's like go due west as the sun sets and turns left at the Rocky Mountains.
Exactly. Directions was so much easier back then.
Yeah. But immediately it's good because this is dispelled because he sucks as a trapper and as a mountain man initially.
Uh, which points to the scene where he was flailing around in the water, getting all cold, and trying to start a fire, which is one of my favorite scenes because you see him and he's blowing on his hands and he's got these
Yeah.
half-ass gloves, and then you feel cold just watching
Oh
him.
yeah.
And you're like, oh, I hope he gets it. And then he gets it started. And you're like, oh, you're starting to warm up and feel good.
Uh,
And then a big thing of snow falls off the tree onto it. And then, it's a certain amount of like, you know, comedy, even though you feel it, like, because you're with him, but he's obviously not trained in the ways of the survivalist slash mountain man, because this is all
right.
about mountain man and
Yeah.
what's your relationship to the mountain. And we hear about that again and again, but I don't think he would be qualified at this point in his journey as a full-blown mountain man.
No, and it's not until he comes across Bear Claw, Chris Lapp, who's who's he played by?
He's
Who's the
played
actor?
by he's played by
Will
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 Greer.
Will Gear, yeah. And he's kind of a classic actor of the 50s and 60s, having done a ton of television that era, like those types of people that would just he was in a million different Western TV shows and films, and you know I mean, he's someone that if we watched a half a dozen movies, we'd be like, oh, yeah, that's that guy. Oh, yeah, that's that guy. He did like an episode of Kung Fu where he was a judge, stuff like that. Like, so he was in Bewitched. God, like, what an era to be an actor. He just pop in and out of shows here and there.
I mean, he was
But anyway,
blacklisted too. So that's an
oh,
interesting thing about him. Yeah, he
yeah.
was blacklisted. He was a good friend of Woody Guthrie's and just kind of like, so he's kind of that leftist part of Hollywood, that got marginalized after the 50s for so many years and kind of
Mhm.
came back into attention in the late 60s and 70s, given the new breed of director. But yeah, interesting figure.
And so he's like the first kind of familial character. He becomes like a surrogate father, and he teaches Jeremiah the ways of being a mountain man, and he shows him how to live. He basically rescues him. He would have probably died. He would have died just like the man. What is it? Hatchet Jack, because
Oh,
he had a couple scenes earlier come across a man frozen to death holding his gun who labeled himself with basically a will. When it's like, I'm Hatching Jack, and I be dead. My legs are broken, and but I killed the bear that killed me.
exactly. This gun killed the bear that killed me, and the way he leaves that on his chest, and he pulls it off. But just the detail of him frozen to death is really it starts and it creates a really intense kind of sense of this environment and how cruel it is. And
Mhm.
I think it really does a good job of that. I mean, Antonella, when we were watching it, she's like, oh, this scene again. I hate looking at it because you think about your mortality, right? You think about yourself frozen to death, and that's kind of what you might look like. And all
Yeah.
your, your essence is gone. Yet there's this body here, and he's peeling the 50-aught gun from his hands.
Yeah.
It's a powerful scene, frankly.
Yeah. And it's ominous in a sense that it without Bear Claw, you get a sense like Jeremiah Johnson was, he was going to be, making his own grave soon enough.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I agree.
And so what's interesting about Bear Claw is he kind of is feeling out Jeremiah Johnson a bit as a person as well, and he's guiding him by showing him what to do, but he's trying to teach him about the land and how unforgiving it is, and but most importantly, he's trying to probe and say like, what the hell are you doing here?
Yeah,
You know, what are you trying to get out of this? And because Jeremiah Johnson isn't presented as someone who's like seeking adventure. He's initially shown as as a veteran of probably the Mexican American War, and in the research, because Jeremiah Johnson is based on a true story, actually, liver eating Johnson, and he's more myth of a character than real. I mean, in a lot of ways, and that man actually had deserted the war, witnessing the violence, and this is his answer was to just go into the wilderness and try to be a hermit. And he basically, what are some of the lines? It's like to get here, what there's nature couldn't gets them below. God, I love the language. It's trying to decipher it. Many a child's journeys this high to be different. Like this idea of like people come up here thinking the world's going to be different, but you can't cheat a mountain. And he keeps
yeah,
calling him
a
pilgrim. You
pilgrim,
can't.
and it's
And then he starts. He's about to explain what a mountain has got, and then suddenly his advice ends because like there's an actual threat, and he has to deal. But this idea of you can't cheat the mountain, and you're not going to find the difference in life that you're expecting up here.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's not going to be. This isn't a solution to your problems, it's just a series of different problems, and are you ready for them? And it's interesting too because we learn slowly that Jeremiah is coming from the Mexican American War in
Yeah,
the 1850s. And we also learned in The Searchers that's where Ethan was coming from. And like
right.
there's this whole notion of maybe the violence in that war, or it's a war that's very little talked about. It happened very quickly, and it gave America like more land than any other war that was fought. They got like all of Texas, a
And
good part of
California.
California, right?
Yeah,
Like they got a ton of land, and there's never really discussed. And it'd be interesting to see like what's the other side of that war. Like,
mm,
what did it look like? Right? Who fought who? I'd be very interested to see what the details of that war were, and how bloody it was in terms of this kind of cowboy western vision. Because
yeah,
it's referenced now in at least two of the five westerns we watched, which is interesting.
yeah. And the sense is like there are things that Jeremiah is trying to escape, and he's not really absorbing what he's escaping to right now. And that's what Bear Claw is trying to point out to him. It's like, you don't know what you're getting into, son. And
Yeah,
he's at least trained him up, good kid. Now you've got some skills. And like a good son, he has to go out on his own and explore the world. And what does he come across? I mean, and they show, and then they kind of redo the montage, right? Which is interesting. Now, like there's the initial montage of him suffering and being terrible at trapping and hunting, when he first sets out. And then post Bear Claw, he's very successful. He's a skilled man. He knows what he's doing. But this is immediately kind of contrasted with what he comes across, the massacred family
yeah,
and the homestead and she's literally named the Crazy Woman, which is based in real life. Apparently there was a woman of this era whose children were massacred, and she stayed behind, and the local crow named the area the Crazy Mountains in honor of her in a weird way. Like that stuff like that is so bizarre if you think about it. It's like, oh, we murdered her kids but leave her alone, and like, whoa, what a touched woman she is. We must touch her and not go near her and respect her. And that's kind of these kind of bizarre ethos
Yeah.
and the
Like
norms of
once
culture.
someone's touched, they're off limits is a super
Yeah,
interesting kind of thing that they talk about in Jeremiah Johnson. But also the moment when she approaches Jeremiah Johnson with the gun, obviously she's kind of in the process of dressing up her kids who have been scalped and killed, and it's a dark scene. She comes
yeah,
to him, and Jeremiah Johnson's like not at all concerned. She's about to shoot him. Seemingly, I would
right,
be freaking out. He's like,
yeah,
"Woman, I'm here to help you, woman. We got to
yeah,
bury these bodies." And
yeah. We've got graves to dig.
oh yeah, and it's just such a very matter of fact like look at what you see is a really horrific scene that she's
Yeah,
kind of trying to manage not very well, and he's kind of being completely disassociated from it, deal with it as we need to. It's an interesting scene in that like it sets up a real look, and we saw that in like the New Land, and we saw that a bit in the Searchers, of just how hard it must have been, right?
hmm,
Like how horrific it must have been for people to be out on the frontier, truly, and all of what could happen to them, right? And
right.
we saw that a lot in the New Land with those families that were there, and then you had the Sioux who came through. And because of all sorts of other politics, had massacred families, and that's what you're looking at here.
Yeah, it's this is kind of the second time, now that I'm thinking about it, something that comes up is like Jeremiah Johnson is presented as this even tempered man, right?
Yeah,
Like high in contrast with Ethan, right? Ethan is like just crazed, and Shane is fairly even tempered, but he knows he's an instrument of violence. He's just holding back.
yeah.
It's a charade, like his even temperedness, because we know he's a killer. And he reminds me a bit of Karl Oscar in that regard. Like even though they're in completely different contexts in many ways. Well, I mean they're both enduring awfulness of the hardships of the frontier, but their goals are incredibly different, and so that's where they're very very different.
I mean, he plays Karl Oscar at certain times, but at
Yeah,
other
exactly.
times, he's also plays almost all the other characters we've seen up and
Yeah,
until now. And it's worth talking about that as we come to these different moments.
yeah,
It's almost like Jeremiah Johnson is like a recap of all the different possibilities, right? That we've already watched in the first four
yeah,
films. I found that interesting.
yeah. And so with the crazy woman, he successfully helps her, bury her family, and she's overcome. And it's just suddenly there's this bizarre moment when he's finally exploring the cabin, and he comes across another survivor, and it's the boy. And this is the beginning of the accidental family that Jeremiah Johnson builds, because he's like yelling at a distance. It's like, hey, we should go, because you won't leave. And it's like this, you and I'll take you to the town, and they call it the. I love how Bear Claw calls it the flat,
Yeah.
or it's just town, and what that means exactly. It's technically where there's civilization, where it gets more muddy because it's warmer because it's off the mountain, and there's farmers there. you know, it's so great how they it's an othering place, interestingly, to these people that are of the mountains. But the crazy one comes racing back and says, like, you take him. And he's like, what? No. And but this touched stare that she gives, he's like, okay, I guess I'm taking him. And it's important because he accepts the role of a new father, and the most interesting way is that he gives him a name. Because the boy never speaks throughout the entire film. And so he gives him, it's like, you will be named Caleb. It's a good name, and that's plain spokenness comes. But this is kind of an emblem of his accepting his role.
It's also an emblem of how kids were treated in the 70s. Shut the hell up. Don't say a word. This is not about you. It's about me.
Go play outside, Jim
Exactly.
Groom.
Caleb, shut up.
I'll call you. I'll ring the bell when we want you to come inside.
Caleb, go tie up those horses. Caleb, you're not coming with me. Caleb, I know you've had awful traumatic experiences, but I don't give a shit. Shut up. Go over there.
So, so what you're saying, he was basically the perfect '70s son.
Oh, he's the perfect 70s dad, too. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
balance there.
Yeah, yeah, which is coming up with his next family member, which we're going to learn. And he says, "This is I'm a great hunter. I'm a fine figure of a man." Those are my favorite lines.
No, that's the best part of the movie, I think. That's the
Yeah, yeah,
greatest moment, in fact.
yeah. So they run across, Del Gue, who's this kind of wild man of a bad trapper who gets
Okay.
in a bad
It's
way with
worth
some.
talking a bit about how they come across Telgu,
Yeah, yeah,
because
we're
this is
getting there.
another
So
favorite.
Del Gue has been left to basically burn to death in the desert with his head sticking out of a hole. I imagine with his hands tied behind his back, so he can't have any ability to escape. And the transactional language between he and Jeremiah is just so funny because he's like having a bad day. Basically, he's like, "Nope, nope, just need a little shade. Can you pass me a hat?"
I mean, he is so, unperturbed by his situation. I mean, his situation is dire, and
Oh,
he just could care less, and not asking for help in particular. He's saying, having a bad day. And he's like, well, no, I'm fine. My horse is beneath me. Right. Like, it's just like, it's a great moment. And it's like something out of again, I've referenced this in other times. It's something out of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Just the way he looks, he almost looks like the judge with his bald head and this
yeah.
really horrific landscape with this kind of desert-like space that like he's just burning in the sun. Really is a moment, and it's a striking moment when they come up on him.
Yeah. And so they, of course, let him go. And Delgue's most important role ultimately is they seek retribution of the Blackfeet that had, buried him and stolen his ponies and his cart. He had like supplies and whatnot. But what matters is that and after they do this, and this was not, and this is again, he's trying to be even tempered. They were saying like, no, let's not kill them. Let's go at night and just take back your stuff. But Del Gue is perfectly happy to wake them up and shoot them down, half awake, and even scalp them.
Yeah.
And this leads to they come across this other tribe that they don't know is another tribe, and so Del Gue gives the scalps to
Doesn't give
Jeremiah.
them, hides them on the back of his horse. I mean,
Yeah,
this guy
so
is
he
a
won't
piece
be
of
busted with
work.
them. But they turn out to be a friendly tribe that actually are not aligned with the Blackfeet, and then celebrate them for having killed and vanquished their enemies. But Jeremiah, being this person who he's constantly trying to push himself away from these cultures. Like he's made trade and been friendly with Native Americans, as pictured in that scene of like him being a good mountain man. But he doesn't want to be known as the person who scalped Blackfeet and stole their ponies. And so he's like, you take them. And this leads to the very important discovery that, oh my gosh, you can't make a trade. You can't give something away. There's always a trade is implied by the offering. And this is where he's given the Flathead's daughter, Swan, as a bride.
And it's interesting. I mean, this is a great scene for a lot of reasons. One of the things I love in particular about it is this Flathead tribe is actually a syncretic tribe. So they had been influenced by French missionaries, and
Mm-hmm.
they were Christian. Yet
Yeah.
their Christian, beliefs were also, when they do the marriage dance, they're doing the, holy,
The,
like,
the crossing of
cross,
themselves. Yeah.
but then they're also doing the Native American back and forth with the
Yeah.
hands and the balancing, and it's such a wild integration, because you also often think of that with, like, the African Americans in the South, and the way in which they took Christianity and mixed it in with some of the African beliefs. Well, here you see it with the Native Americans, and it's a really powerful moment, that kind of
Mhm.
sense that, you know, they took that Christianity and they kind of made part of it themselves, like part of it their own. And
Yeah, they
it's interesting. Now, it doesn't end well, in the end, like, nor does it end well for a bunch of cultures when the West comes in. But it was wild to see it, and the attention to detail that Pollock makes on that, to show how they're between cultures, right? There's a
right.
threshold of, how savage they are in relationship, to the culture in which is, part and parcel of, who they kind of, this is the Flatheads are in some ways a very relatable tribe. Even his wife, eventually is relatable. And there's something about that that's interesting, and we haven't seen really in any other westerns we've dealt with.
No, we haven't. No, this was one of the things that the film was credited with at the time, was like the presentation of, whites' relationships to Native Americans, with a lot more understanding of the interactions that were real and sympathetic. Ultimately, yes, there were tribes that were, much more vicious and just there to say, like, get off my land, I'm going to kill you. But then there was ones that respected, and they respected and traded with, and, as you say, they assimilated each other's cultures, and, and that's the beginning of what is probably the most intimate moment. And it's kind of interesting. This is one of the most kind of grounded families, and poetic ones, like the way that they
Yeah.
truly, the three of them, work together. So, but it starts in such the most funny of ways, because suddenly, Delgue is like bald headed crazy Delgue is just laughing his ass off as he realizes he's like giving this man a bride, and he's like, "Outie, I'm gone."
Exactly.
You know?
Don't want to interrupt you on your wedding night.
Yeah, yeah. And he's like, "You got to do it, man. It's like, if you value the hair on your head, you got to get married." And so, and you're describing this wedding that is this mixture of cultures, and so this becomes this weird accidental family he suddenly has,
Yeah.
of this boy who won't speak, this woman who does not, they don't understand one another at all, and yet, you know, they start to figure things out. You don't think they're going to figure anything out, because she makes a meal for him, and he's a mountain man, so he eats meat, and she makes this cornmeal uh biscuit of sorts, and he basically kind of practically spits it out and hides it in favor of beef jerky. Um and then he takes this moment to finally present himself to her, which is, he
It's the
immediately
best.
presented himself to the boy, and he presents himself, and I've already alluded to this,
Oh,
and it's his way of like affirming himself as the man of the house, if you will, right? It's like out of a 50s style TV show, and it's like, "I'm a great hunter," he says. "Yes." And then he makes her understand the word yes, and tries to nod her head forward, like, so she'll understand what it's an affirmational statement. And she's like resistant at first.
yeah.
And
She's like, what?
he's like, "Fuck off, don't touch me,"
Exactly. Stop touching my head.
Yeah. And then he's like, I'm a fine figure of a man. Yes.
And she's like, yes.
Yeah,
That's so good. And he
I
comes
will.
up, and then he has this like Whitman like yelp where he's like, yeah, which is so good. I mean, and like, I'm really into that scene because it's like, yeah, I mean, all you really need for other people to understand you is for them to say yeah to everything you say, pretty much. Like, that's paradise.
And so there is a paradise of sorts that's built, and I love, like, and they start to learn to work together, like, and he listens to her, they come across some quail, and he pulls out his 50 caliber weapon, and she's like, "Dude, you're going to blow the feathers off of that thing if you shoot that weapon at it." And she shows herself that she's capable of tackling these quail with some stones, and they're like, "That's good." There's these like nice little, the montage kind of starts up again, right?
Yeah.
And this time it's the building of the family montage, if you will. And then it's this leads to, kind of the gift moment, right? Where they together trap a beaver, and they're so proud of him for trapping this beaver, and he
Yeah.
gives the,
Yeah,
yes,
he gives the
I'm the
absolutely.
man. Yes,
Yeah,
I'm the man.
totally.
And
It's
then
so
there's
good.
probably the most poetic moment where they build a cabin. Like they come across this piece of land, and he says simply, you know, behind there's a cliff, and in front there's a river. This will make a good home.
Yep, clean water.
And then it's just this kind of awesome, it's like a one of those shows from now that it's like how to build a log cabin, and it's like, you ever seen, there's this YouTube channel of this guy who goes out into the woods, and he just like uses raw tools and shows, and he by himself builds these structures and stuff like that. It's kind of like that, but instead of him being a dumb one white dude working all by himself, this is a family, and they build this home together. And then when it's finally finished, they cross its threshold, and he literally lifts his son across the threshold as they
Yeah.
enter.
I mean, obviously, I thought a lot about this because in New Land, that's a big part of the movie is them building
Yeah.
the house that they're going to live in, and
Mhm.
you're coming into this, and immediately this is made about the same time as New Land, 72, 71. So there's a lot of kind of overlap in that idea of creating this kind of stable home. But this one is not stable, as we'll learn. And while we
Right.
have a moment of reprieve and happiness, and as Antonella said, as we were watching this a second time, it's like, all right, this is the last bit of happiness in this movie. Like it's time for me to go. Um, and that's the sadness about Jeremiah
Yeah.
Johnson is, what the the New Land dealt with that kind of what it means to create that family and go on for generations and what you lose in this process. But I think that threshold that Jeremiah Johnson crosses with, his new wife and his, adopted son, it's just temporary. And he remains in that threshold space like throughout. Like he never gets to truly enjoy a home. And we'll
Right.
talk about that and learn that. But
I mean,
this is the moment, right, where you're like, oh my God, things can be good, even in the
yeah, I mean,
mountains for mountain men.
it's he it is the only moment where he shows emotion. You had somewhere else in your notes that throughout the film, like his expressions get, more and more clipped, and he communicates less and less.
Yeah.
Um, but in this moment, like this is where he actually, for the only time, smiles. He's
Yeah.
in this moment with Swan where she's trying to outfit him
Oh,
with a
that's the
bear coat
best.
that she's going to
Yeah.
sew for him,
Yeah.
and and we learn she speaks. He's like, "What are you doing? This thing's heavy, woman." And she says something in her language, native language, and he speaks back to her in his native language. So he's built an understanding. He's not just compelling her now anymore to just like nod her head for her. Yes. And it's a humorous moment, and it's a moment of closeness,
It
you
is.
know?
And his style is great. He has
Yeah.
got the hat and the coat. And then there's
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
red, one he has on before, and there's a green one. And Antonella was like, yeah, he looks pretty cool. Like, I'm kind of
Oh yeah.
digging his style. Like,
Mhm.
there's that 70s piece of it too, right? Like, you
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
the 70s style creep into Jeremiah Johnson, which I love.
Yeah. And there's, and he's also, kind of shepherding the boy through what it's like and trying to teach him the ways of a mountain man and be a trapper and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Or even the
And
field hockey. Like, there's even play.
yeah, right. Yeah.
You
There's an
never see
actual moment of
play
play.
in the
No.
Western, but this is a
Yeah.
moment where you actually see them playing like some
Yeah.
version of field hockey.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, and he goes off and does his hunting and trapping and
Oh,
comes back. And, there's a moment when he's out there and he gets attacked by a wolf pack, and she kind of repairs his wounds, and, and these are
so
truly tender moments
let me
of a
ask you
feeling.
this because
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
something Antonella brought up. So this she gets full credit for this. See, I'm just basically her vessel.
Okay.
I watch the movies with her. She has all the good ideas, and then I come to you. Basically, she was saying like it's interesting because the wolf scene reminded her a lot of the bear scene from Revenant, but
Yeah.
not as obviously as technically,
Right. A graphic.
acute,
Yeah.
yeah, and not as graphic. And she really enjoyed the 70s film because it's different pace and it's a lot slower and it's not going to the same thing of Revenant. But there is a bit of the Revenant in, or Jeremiah Johnson in the Revenant. Even like there's a lot of Jeremiah Johnson in The Outlaw Josie Wales. And Jeremiah Johnson is actually probably a far more influential Western than I've ever given it credit for. I always thought it was
Yeah.
just some weird Western out there on the edges, but it kind of starts a whole kind of like idea of this, loner, isolationist, get away
Hmm.
from civilization that we keep on returning to, especially as we feel like we can't escape civilization anymore. Like it's impossible, right?
Yeah.
It becomes even more and more important to us to have something like this. Even Pollock says, even though he knows it's not true, it's an ideal he wants to believe in. And I really
Yeah.
like that quote that you pulled.
Yeah. 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 I just watched another film that's definitely influenced by. I mean, he credits Terrence Malick, who this director named Clint Bentley, who had recently made the film Train Dreams that was at the 2025 Sundance Film Festival and was like a darling film there, and Netflix bought it. And I watched it the other night, and it's basically a Jeremiah Johnson character. He's an orphan. He ends up in Idaho. And in the time period is like, just picture it pushing like 60, 70 years. And he's on the cusp of no longer being a frontiersman because the Industrial Revolution is about to start.
Yeah.
And he's participating in a frontier life of sorts by being primarily a hatchet man. Like he's cutting down trees and lumber. He works with the gangs of men that either he worked on a railway gang, or he actually cut down trees, and he makes relationships. But it becomes this story about his relationship that he makes with a woman, and he builds a log cabin with by a river,
Yeah.
and it tragically falls apart. As you could tell, it's coming in the film, that this is going to happen. And it similar becomes a man separated and just reconciling with loss for the remainder of the film, and in a very different way. And it's pretty great. I encourage you to watch it. Joel Edgerton is the man, and Felicity Jones, who I fucking love from Rogue One,
Oh yeah.
is his wife.
No, it's
And
interesting. I mean, I'm sorry.
but you're right. Like I think this film is unrecognizable, is not recognized as much as you're postulating as an influence.
Yeah, I mean, and just like even thinking about it when she talked about Revenant, I'm like, yeah, and Outlaw Josie Wales, and just about every notion of the Western isolation kind of individualist, kind of,
Yeah.
I don't think it starts here, but this is a really beautiful rendition of it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like from start to finish. Anyway,
Well, this film is focused on the consequences of that's your focus. Like if this is your
yeah,
focus is to be alone, your life is going to be tragic ultimately. And because what ends up happening is ultimately, he's imposed upon by the American government. They approach him, and it's really interesting because at this point he's Paul Robert Redford has shaved his beard for Swan because he's giving her a rash as they've been making out, because
yeah.
they're a real family, Jim.
Yep, they have consummated.
Yes, they had a
They
wedding
are
night.
bona fide.
Yeah, and so he does this for her, and it's really this really funny moment where she's like, "Who the fuck are you, man? Where's your beard?" Like,
Exactly.
he's like,
Yeah.
"It's still me, man." But so he's like guarding them. Like he steps out of the hearth of the home as both Caleb and Swan stand in the threshold, in that classic, like, we know that these are not going to be, we never know who's going to come to our door and what violence lays out there. And of course, this time it's appropriately coming from duty, for your whiteness, for your culture, and you need to ignore your familial bond that you've built in honor of your race ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting too because I really love when he finally decides to do it, he takes them down, and the whole predicament that leads to the tragedy of the movie is if they go through sacred grounds, the Crow sacred burial grounds, they'll save a significant amount of time and be able to save these folks. Otherwise, they'll have 20 more miles around, which
Right.
could lead them to starving, or at least that's what they're always saying. How could you starve your own people? You know, Jeremiah, you're so. And so he's in this kind of moral conundrum. He decides to go through against his better judgment the sacred burial ground. But what I really
Mhm.
love about that scene or series of scenes, because he goes through and then he immediately leaves them and goes back, because I think he's kind of concerned about what he's done, is the amount of attention they spend on each of the skeleton remains of
Mm.
those Native Americans, because you know they're going through and it's kind of a weird scene. Like you feel it's a little bit haunted, but it's also like you get a sense that there is he has stepped over a line and they are watching, whether it's kind of a mythos or not, or a kind of uh, how would you say it, a kind of like what they consider like a fake religion, or like how could you believe such nonsense, but he does, and he's scared. And I think you as a watcher are also in the situation, like how can Robert Redford do that, how can Jeremiah Johnson do that, like this is a kind of thing he knew. And I think this gets back to an earlier point you made that I'm fascinated by is the Native Americans really never act irrationally towards the white settlers. I don't know about the massacre, but with, you know, Jeremiah Johnson's family, this is retribution for him stepping over a line.
Right.
And like, so in that regard, like, you really get a sense of like they're kind of justified, right? Like they
Mm.
have a line and they stepped over it, and so they Jeremiah Johnson has to pay the piper, and that's a
Yeah,
super interesting frame here.
and he knows he's stepped over the line, and he knows that, there's when the cavalry first show up to entreat him to come help them rescue or guide them to these families that are stuck, this mini wagon train of 3 wagons. He knows, because they say, like, aren't you friendly with the Crow? And he's like, where'd you hear that? Like, what makes you think that's true? And it's like, well, I've heard in town, but that's a town perspective. It's not a perspective of someone who's living amongst the Crow. And so it's a very different perspective. And that's what leads to this, like, there is a culture that is still othering Native Americans, right? Like
Yeah,
the people from town, because he talks about this is Crow Nation, and then the Reverend Lindquist says this is Colorado. What was it? Colorado property or something like that, or
yeah,
incorporated. It's like, no, it's not.
yeah.
This is corporate property, basically, of the United States.
And that sense of encroachment, you can feel it, because, but also you can feel back in town, Jeremiah Johnson is already kind of a bit of a myth. The
Yeah.
fact that he survived so long, he's been there, he's integrated himself into the kind of the mountain way of life, which by all examples from this movie is an intense lifestyle. And if you can make it, it
Mhm.
is in some ways an award into itself, and people probably praise you. It's almost like getting into the NFL or something like that. Like, oh my God, you made it! Like you can survive. But and that just gets more and more. But I really did like that scene where the turning point made sense. Like there
Yeah.
was this sacred ground, and I love the way it was filmed. He stepped over that line to help, this other community he feels just as alienated from.
Right.
But like you said, it was that racial bond, that sense of how can you betray your whiteness?
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting scene here.
Yeah, and so he does rush home, sure enough, to find that both Caleb and Swan have been massacred. And, the way he deals with this is to basically, like, erase their existence. Like, he honors them by putting them in the family bed of the It's like a burial of sorts and blankets in the family hearth. But then he burns and torches the entire cabin. And, it's so sad because this is like this most tender and simple of families, and then it's just brutally destroyed,
Yeah.
and then and this becomes his motivation. It's like it becomes vengeance begets vengeance begets vengeance, and that's like the remainder of the film focuses on that, and he becomes more and more pulled away from any sense of society, and it's a loss he can't handle.
And it's interesting because now we just go into a kind of a cycle of violence. So
Yeah.
now we're back almost at the Searchers, right?
Right.
Where he kind of becomes Ethan. So at a
Correct.
certain point, he was like Carl Oscar. Now he's like Ethan. You can make arguments as they're trying to build a sense of community and relatable. Like there might be a space where Shane comes up. His whole sense of masculinity and how that kind of falls in, that's always there in relating us to Meek's Cutoff in some ways. But like the next 30, 40 minutes of the movie, which I love, Antonella hates, but I love it, is like these like one-off attacks of crows against him. And they don't come like the Apache in 50, like Dejoux says. How do you say his
Yeah,
name?
Delgue. Yeah.
Delgue says they come one. So it's basically like you'll send a crow, and that one crow, his job is to basically kill Jeremiah Johnson. And
Right.
so it's these one-offs, and it's great because you could see, you know, Milius all over this because it's kind of like Conan the Barbarian, right? They're
Yeah.
on rocks fighting, and they're doing this
Yeah.
and that.
It's similar
I
to
love
Conan's,
this
like,
part.
bathed in blood, when he becomes like the fighter for these fight pits that he's part of, and he
Oh
just
yeah,
eviscerates man after man with different weapons and different systems, and
that's great.
what is good in life?
Yeah, exactly.
To vanquish you, to kill your enemies, and hear the lamentations of your women.
Women.
It's like and Jeremiah Johnson is becoming a Conan of sorts. Like he has no connection to anything, and
Nope.
because the cost is too high, and his life of survival continues, but he's not connected to anything, and it culminates with him kind of revisiting. First, he revisits the many, because they use his beard because it's a good time device, right? Because he had shaved for
That's right.
Swan, and then he immediately stopped shaving again, and so his beard growing again becomes this time device, and he returns to the burned out shelter or their home, and you get a sense like he feels nothing of it, right? It's there's no connection anymore, and he kind of runs into Delgue, and Delgue has hair now, which is hilarious.
Yeah, that is hilarious.
And he's this kind of vision of like masculine certainty, that you might say is of Meek's Cutoff. Like he's like, I'm gonna get it. I'm going out there. I'm gonna do just fine. And he tries to connect with Jeremiah, like, hey, come with me. We'll be men again together, right? Didn't we have good times? And he's just talking. It's like, what happened to that Indian woman? And he's like, he's just simple. It's like she weren't no trouble,
Yeah.
right? And he also asks, it's like, what have you been up to? It's like, have you been around? And it's like, and he's like, I've been to town, and that's all he can say. And he's not going there. And Delgue being his pompous self, and he's bigger than life, and he heads over the mountain talking about his mother, and the Rocky Mountains is the marrow of the world, and I'm gonna suck on all of it. Basically.
I ain't seen the Alps and I ain't seen the Andes, but I can tell you that he's just great, like going on and on. And you're right, he's very much like Meek, like that blustering kind of, somewhat of a fool, though he seems he can handle himself. And I'm sure Meek could to some degree. But there was that sense where Delgue is a really good example of like, what maybe being alone for so long in your own kind of loop does to you, right?
Yeah.
It kind of makes you nuts.
Yeah. And it makes you, you've been reading too much of your own paper.
Exactly. exactly. Yeah.
You know, he's just buying it, and he's a part, and then it ends, I think, towards the end, like where he's he oh I forgot, I almost forgot, he returns also, like he's doing a tour of his past. The film finally, like he's been almost killed by like dozens of crow at this point, and
That's
he's
just the
making
best.
this tour of his past, starting with his his burned out home, and then running into Delgue, and then for some odd reason he returns to where the massacred family was.
Yeah.
And that one is like kind of mystifying. It's like, what was he, oh, I really wonder what he thought he was looking for returning there, you know. And
Maybe the boy's mother, or maybe the father who they said was gone but could.
yeah,
But what I really loved about that scene is, so there he finds a settler in the
yeah,
house, and the settler, he kind of talks to him, and the settler realizes, as they go over, and Jeremiah Johnson figures out that the settler told his whole family to go hide out in like some sort of
the wheat
grain
bag.
house or some
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
corn house. And the settler starts talking about, oh, wait, you're Jeremiah Johnson.
yeah,
You're the one that the Native Americans come here all the time to this mound, this dirt mound, and they keep on decorating it with new things. And he's like, but I'm not dead. And he's like, it's not a grave. I think it's essentially like almost like a statue or a
mhm,
memorial for all
yeah,
the Native Americans that he has killed, or all the crow that he's killed. And so he is becoming like, there's that moment where Jeremiah Johnson is moving into the mode of myth, right? And
right,
I love it because what he says is, hiding your family in there ain't going to do you any good. You know what I mean? That's all he has to
no,
say. It's like
no,
super practical. Like, you're an idiot. Don't hide your family in there because they're going to kill him anyway. Um, I was fascinated by that moment because you have like the myth of Jeremiah Johnson being built here, and you can see it, and then you have the man who's just solely focused on survival.
yeah. And his final kind of interaction is with Bear Claw as he finds him yet again. And, you know, he again tries to connect with him. He's like, wow, you've come far, pilgrim. And he's like, it feels like far,
Yeah,
right? It
that's right.
feels like far. And then, was it worth the trouble? And he just says, what trouble? And it's so unsettling because there was all this trouble, and there was this entire family he'd built and a lot of success learning to trap and feeling like life was going to be an answer. It had a vision for him. He had a vision of his life, and this is ultimately about, in a lot of ways, like this seeking of solitude and getting lucky, right, ultimately, and finding
Yeah.
something more than you imagined you would ever find, but then it's taken away, and then it's ultimately much worse than it ever could have been, um, because he had a small taste, right, ultimately, and there's no coming back from it. In my mind, I think he was pretty done. I mean, he was going to live. That's the thing about this, and it's so funny. Train Dreams does this too. It's like this man is going to live. He's going to find his way through the rest of his life, but all he does is just live in this imagined past of the myth of that was his life. Like, the idea is like, so there's this whole myth you're describing that's built around him killing Indians and killing and surviving in the woods and all his capability, but that's a myth he's not even thinking about. He's remembering the myth of like his mini moment of home,
Yeah,
right?
of
And
happiness.
yeah,
And
and
it's
that
interesting. I'm sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, go you go ahead.
Now, I was just going to say it's interesting too because this is a 72 Western. So you got the 60s and like all of the hope and promise of the 60s, right? And the kind of resistance and the power. And
Mm,
yet this is a very hopeless Western. There's no sense of hope in the end. There's just this idea of survival. That whole
yeah,
myth system is dead. What does it serve, even if he is built up to be this, great killer of crow or whatever? It just doesn't seem to have any meaning. And
right.
part of it is, you know, his the loss of his family in some ways was a kind of, collateral damage of just being there, right? and
Yeah.
being in the mountains and doing what he's doing. And I just think there's this interesting, unlike all of the other, like with Carl Oscar and in the New Land, they might be dejected that their kids maybe don't write or speak in Swedish anymore and all that, but there's a transition. And for their kids, there's hope. And you feel like they've done what they
Mhm.
promised to do. Whereas here, there's no hope. The family has been killed horribly. He has gone back for revenge again and again and again. You get a little bit of sense from the crow at the end that maybe the fight's over, but that's not even clear. But in the end, like he's left with nothing, no home, no stability, no sense of promise, no sense of what's next. It's a very bleak ending.
Yeah. No, and it's this indictment of this desire for solitude, which I think in now is really interesting. Like in the era of like men with their solo stupid videos of how they do what they design their perfect morning and coffees and exercise routines, and they're imagining that this solitude is going to lead to enlightenment, right? Through
Yeah.
their routines of perfection, right? And like self knowledge through a monastic lifestyle, and it's
What kind of
bullshit.
videos do you watch? I don't watch those videos. My
I don't
videos are
either.
all people like freaking out over a, 1980s VHS tape, and they're
Oh
weird,
well,
and they're
mine are all people.
isolationists in different
Okay,
ways.
the videos I'm watching are people playing Magic the Gathering, so that's also not that too. But okay, I read about this stuff, and it's described to me in the
I
context
gotcha.
of the.
You've heard.
I've heard of these videos through Derek Thompson and others
That's awesome. No,
of
but
the
I'm joking, obviously, but
yeah
I was struck by Jeremiah Johnson in that it kind of went through the whole range of the previous four movies, which are The Searchers, Shane, um, New Land, Meek's Cut Off, and it kind of I saw elements of all of them in it, but at the end there was nothing. And I was
right.
kind of struck by that. You know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
it went through all of them. It kind of had associations with all of them. But this was probably the darkest, most existential, even though that was New Land in some ways. This took New Land and was like, actually, I'll see you one. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, like, thinking again about how the reviews of the time were kind of celebrating him to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
And his solitude and his success in vanquishing, in making quote unquote peace with the crow at the end there. And now the way you and I view this is like, wow, this is terrible. Like in your life sucks. And which really makes me, and this is the beginning of what I talked about right before we started recording, is like, this is the first series where I'm really enjoying and finding an understanding of how looking at a genre or set of films through the lens of family is really interesting, right? Because I don't think we would have so clearly decided that Jeremiah Johnson was such a a tragic ending if we hadn't decided to look at it strictly through originally, primarily through the lens of family, because
Yeah.
that is clearly the tragedy of the film. He's this tragic character, though he's celebrated, and some people see that as an actual celebration, right? And that's that unknowing side. That's the down in the flat or the people in town. That's the kind of criticisms. They're the people from the town. But if you lived in the mountain, if you understand the mountain, you realize you're fucked,
Yeah.
and I think that that's what all these films are doing by looking at it. It's like whether it's Shane who's screwed, or Ethan who's screwed, or even poor Carl Oscar,
Yeah.
and what's her name,
Christina.
played by Michelle Williams, and Meek's Cutoff, because that
Yeah.
film ends with, we don't know, even though it's based on real history, so we know they survived. She's like, her survival is dependent on, hey, idiots, men, we don't know what's going to happen, but we have to make a choice. And it's
Yeah.
not going to be killing this guy.
Exactly. And I love also too, like talking about that choice piece. There's a point in I'll shut up about Jeremiah Johnson in a minute, but I just thought it was such a great. I hadn't really watched it forever, and I really enjoyed it. I watched it twice recently, as I already said. There's a moment in which he says, I didn't ask for this, when he has
Mm,
the boy and he has the wife, and ultimately it's the only moment of happiness in this film for him.
mhm,
But he does note early on, like, I didn't ask for this. Like, I this is not of my doing. And there's another whole piece about, like, your doing almost doesn't matter. Like, what you intended, what you
mm,
thought, like, it doesn't really matter in this regard. And there's a whole thing about that with nature and how brutal and harsh it is. And all I could think of while watching this film was, fuck, I am so glad I'm not like a mountain man. It seems exhausting and horrible. And
right,
I
yeah,
mean, like, if I have to do it, I guess. But there are people who, like, do their little fucking calisthenics and pretend like
mhm,
this is the way, like, I'm
yeah,
ready for
right,
we could do a whole idea of survivalists and family, maybe films or something. And, like, the whole idea of, like, a whole premise on the idea that the end is coming. And, like, how can you, like, hold together these values of being a family and having a sense of hope and possibility with the idea of always looming with the end? And we could talk about nuke babies, our era, right? Like, there are so many eras you could
oh,
talk
yeah,
about, but, like, how
yeah,
much that interferes with the sense of like, what you imagine a family is. You have a family because it's a seed of hope, right? It's this
right,
idea of possibility, not like, oh, everything's going to shit. I'm going to go stockpile guns in the event someone comes on my property.
mhm,
What the
yeah, I
fuck?
mean, Jim, it might be really, really sad, but we'd have to watch a couple television movies because
Oh,
that
the
would
day
involve
after?
the and Threads, which is even more fucking brutal than The Day After, the British, nuclear
I
apocalypse
never
from the
saw
'80s film.
Threads.
Oh, Threads is nuts. Yeah, I mean, I like this because this modern critique of Jeremiah Johnson and others. I didn't read any, so others may have hit here. I'm not saying we're necessarily blazing new ground here, but
Chances are we
it's
aren't.
yeah. But I don't know, the fact that we're articulating Jeremiah Johnson to kind of bro, kind of solo life is the way of life culture is, I think, fairly probably pointed, and like it's empty, right? It's an
Totally.
empty pursuit. And I don't know, I think that's showing that there is some purpose to this set of podcasts, and that's why I'm really into it, Jim Groom.
You mean we have a purpose?
I think we do. Even though it's the end of the year, this is going to be our last one as we hit the holidays. Jim's finally going to take a break. He's finishing his blog tour of 2000.
4,000 posts.
4,000. He's got
You
milestones
just
to meet.
cut me in half. You just cut my blog post number in half. Yeah.
I was in the same order of magnitude,
No,
Frank. Come
you
on.
weren't. You were half
That's
the
what I was. Do you
magnitude.
understand how orders of magnitude work? It is multiples of 10. So I was there in the thousands with you.
I
You were
don't know.
prolific. You are the biggest writer ever known to man in the world of
Yeah,
the raw material.
yeah. Yeah.
At least one of substance. You are not a man alone.
Oh,
You
it's
have real
substance.
responsibilities. So hitting 4,000 is not easy.
And
Right.
I have written some posts about survivalists. I was an EdTech survivalist at some point. So, but I did it jokingly, knowing how empty that whole idea is. In fact, I heard um, Bruce Sterling at a conference in Austin, Texas. Well, it's that famous one, the big tech conference. I forget the name of it.
Oh, South by Southwest?
There it is. And so he basically talked about this whole, he called it Teotihuacan, like the end of the world as we know it. And there's a great acronym. I can't pronounce it. But he talked about that whole mentality and how we've been, and I think for like a good 10 or 20 years, maybe more, in this whole idea of the end of the world is coming, even more than the 80s when you and I were growing up.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very, like, nihilistic moment, like
Right, right.
AI's coming. And before
Right.
that, it's like, the environment's fucking going to hell and we don't
Mhm.
have any option. And it's very hard sometimes to be a parent and navigate all that.
Yeah. Yeah, and like Americans love their apocalyptic culture. We can't help
Totally.
ourselves, whether it's science fiction, environmental, AI. I love those points of view of fiction. Ultimately, in a lot of ways, it's a lot of fun. I mean, that's a completely different podcast, and we would have to get Audrey Waters to join us because I think she'd do us justice. She'd take us
do us justice. She'd mop the floor with us. Is what
this is true. Yeah, she would. Yeah, that would be another adventure for sure. But yeah, we'll be gone for a few weeks. This will be our last one, I think, and we're gonna start the year with, I think, a kind of a recap of our year and a half that we're wrapping into a single year in a sense. And this is, we haven't even said, this is episode, I think, like, what is it? This is episode 48.
I want 2020. Is it 48?
It's going to be 47. Yeah.
I want
so almost at 50.
I want
We're almost in our 50s, Jim. We are quite mature.
I want 2026 to be the year that Michael Branson Smith starts gifting these episodes again. So gifting moments of these. And
so you want me to, that's going to be my New Year's resolution, is I have to make it
it's my New Year's resolution to get you to do it.
You want me? Okay.
But I also think we have to, in 2026, we're going to try and push it a little bit more. Now that we have some sort of a rhythm, we've talked about it, but we're going to try and actually, I don't know, get a listener or two.
Maybe make some. God, we have to use social media then.
Oh, we, Jesus. Huh? Yeah. Talk about the end of the world as you know it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Happy New Year.